automatic checker for all of the best practices outlined in the community Ruby style guide, things pertaining to the layout of the code, things pertaining to what are the preferable classes, methods you should be using if you're facing too much choices, some purely stylistic stuff, like making numeric literals prettier or lambda literals consistent, and so on. And the third thing that Rubocop is, it's also a formatter for Ruby code. You can just feed it ugly code, and Rubocop is going to spin out hopefully beautiful Rubocop and Ruby code, and all of this is extremely configurable. We organize the project into something we call COPS, and COPS make departments. That there are many police puns throughout the Rubocop code base, which makes it confusing to explain it to regular humans, and from time to time confusing even for me to understand it. But it is what it is. So we have many of those good cops who know how to check for different common styles that exist in the Ruby community. For instance, you might prefer single-quoted string literals by default or double-quoted string literals by default. So we have configuration options to inform both styles. You can auto-correct some of the offenses that are unambiguous, and so on. Hopefully all of this makes sense and is a decent overview about the project.
I'm a little curious about the origins of the project. Did it start kind of more on the stylistic side to kind of reduce the bike shedding, or were you more interested in the performance and security aspects of it?
It started mostly on the stylistic side of things. I joined one startup a while ago, and I was the only Ruby developer on the team. I mean, we were all Ruby developers on the team, but I was the only person who had actually done any Ruby beforehand. And a lot of my work was just explaining to my colleagues some really basic things about common Ruby idioms. Most of my colleagues came from different backgrounds that are not Ruby. Obviously, if they weren't Ruby developers, like PHP, Java, C#. And you know what they say, it's very easy to write any language in any language if this is all you know. So we can give you Ruby, you're going to produce Java code with it if all your background is in Java, and so on. So for a while I was just explaining on every code review. That's a good idea, that's a bad idea, and so on. At some point, this became really tiresome, and I just compiled a short internal style guide document, which we wanted all of the engineers to be familiar with. And I don't remember how this became public. Maybe the CTO at the time suggested that we should share it or something along those lines. But I think I blogged about it or something like this. The guide became pretty popular. A lot of people started contributing to it. And one day somebody submitted a ticket. I can dig it up if you want, saying that the guide was very useful, but it was so big that nobody now can remember all of the rules. So it would be really nice to have a tool which checks the rules for you. And this is how Rubocop was born. It started pretty small, and as the project was gaining traction, users, the scope grew and grew. First, it was only stylistic checks. Then we re-implemented all of Ruby's lints with Rubocop, making them significantly nicer, better messages, better location tracking, and stuff like this. Then we added a lot of Rails checks. Then we added performance stuff, security stuff, layout stuff, and all the jazz. Then people started writing plugins for Rubocop, like Rubocop RSpec, and you know, so somehow we ended up here. If somebody had told me 8-9 years ago that out of this tiny style guide, so something so big would come out, I would have never believed it.
Yeah, overall, and I think it's important to remember that these are just kind of like guidelines. They're not set in stone, and you should adopt whatever your team is really comfortable with doing, using double quotes or, single quotes. I think that's important to remember, that as long as the project is consistent and overall using decent practices, I'm usually okay with the code. Like, one of the things that I always disable in Robocop is the line length. So
that is the bane of my existence. I'll tell you what. I hate that one.
The 80 character line length, I think, for me, is really only useful whenever I'm recording a screencast on Drift or Ruby or doing a presentation in PowerPoint, because then you are really more limited to your real estate. But today, with high resolution monitors, 1080p or plus, it really is kind of one of those more annoyances nowadays. But just my opinion.
But I'm curious, why would you disable it? Why don't you simply extend the line length to something that you're more comfortable with? The 80 characters line length might seem somewhat arbitrary in present days. You mentioned that the monitors are significantly more advanced, high resolution, blah, blah, blah. But on my super fancy MacBook in front of me, when I split my screen in two, I can fit exactly 80 character lines on the two sides of the split screen. So I use this mostly as a guideline, what can fit on my screen when I'm working in my typical mode. Usually you're editing on the left and you're checking something else on the right and so on. And I've noticed that other people do it. So even if 80 is too little, I do believe it makes sense to draw the line somewhere. There is also a lot of research showing that people read much faster vertically than horizontally. So if you have a few very annoying lines that are significantly longer than the others, you are ruining the reading flow of your readers. So I'm not trying to convince people to use this. I'm just saying that you can always find arguments for or against pretty much everything in existence.
Yeah, now I definitely like that at the end. But you could also try using like VS Code instead of Emacs. I'm just saying, like, horizontal scrolling is so much better. I'm just kidding.
I hope you are, because I'm very religious about Emacs. My devotion is unquestionable.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the plugin that I can't live without on VS Code is the Emacs key bindings.
Is this thingy VS Code really good? I keep hearing that more and more people are using it, but I cannot understand why, because from what I gathered, it's something super similar to Atom or Atom, however it is pronounced. So I don't really understand what's the selling point if it is mostly the same thing here.
So my main thing with Atom was I was a early adopter many years ago, and it was just hella slow. The amount of memory and sluggishness that it would eventually cause as I'm developing, it wasn't usable. So I had tried it from Sublime Text, and Sublime Text was really awesome, but I kind of got annoyed with the like 4 year long beta that it was in. So I eventually had switched over to VS Code. And once I got over the brand name, the Microsoft brand name of it, I actually really like it as my main editor. So I switched between VS Code and Vim depending on my exact situation. But those are really the two that I use most often.
Mm.
Makes
Yeah, I think
sense.
that is that it's a bit more approachable than Vim or Emacs for newcomers to programming, and maybe the extensibility of it is also a bit more approachable. I wouldn't say it's any more extensible. It's just kind of easier to dip your toes in and get started.
Yeah, I completely understand. I started out with Vim, and I really loved it, but I hated one thing, that you had to extend it with Vim script, which is such a horrible language. I guess that's the reason why 5 people wrote pretty much 90% of all of the popular Vim extensions, because they were the only ones strong enough to survive the Vim script. Then for a while I was using one editor called Komodo. I don't know whether it still exists or not, but what I liked about it was that the extensions were written in JavaScript, and this was so much more approachable. So I assume that's the same thing that works well for Atom, for VS Code, and any other editor using JavaScript as the extension language.
Man, I haven't heard of Komodo in a long, long time. I remember when I first started out developing, that was one of the IDEs I checked out. And I had originally gone from, tried out Komodo, but then switched to RubyMine. And then from RubyMine, just didn't really care for the sluggishness. And then went to Sublime Text and then to VS Code. So, memories.
I used to do some Perl before I was doing Ruby, and Komodo was a very famous editor for Perl. That they also had some IDE versions, so this is what got me there. But now it feels like memories from another life. It was so long ago.
Yeah.
I'm curious, back on Rubocop, are you finding that the adoption now is still driven by kind of teaching idiomatic Ruby to people new to the language, or is there more enthusiasm for the hints around security and the cops that kind of help you tailor your code so it's a bit more performant?
I think it's not that much about the stylistic stuff at this point. I think that people really care about having performant code, about best practices and so on. But I also noticed that one driver of the growth recently was internal COPs that companies developed themselves. Many companies happen to have some libraries they added on top of Rails or whatever framework that they are using. I know that we have such libraries in our company, and we have some checks to make sure that people are using our libraries the way we intended them to be used. We are also using custom COPs to migrate some of the legacy code to code that is using the new libraries on a very big code base. You can save so much time if you just sit down and work a little bit of magic with Rubocop, because also at the heart of Rubocop, we have created a very powerful abstraction over the AST in Ruby. That there is the parser gem, which drives all of the magic. Rubocop was the very first project which adopted the parser gem, Originally, Rubocop was using Ruby's built-in Reaper parser, which has one advantage, that it comes with Ruby, so you know it is more or less always correct, as it is derived from the actual MRI parser. But on the other hand, MRI had a really horrible data representation of the AST. So creating any sort of complicated checks with it was a real nightmare. I had done 7 or 8 versions of Rubocop based on Reaper, and I was extremely frustrated with it. Some deeply nested arrays, no location, limited location metadata, different representations of very similar nodes. For instance, in the AST representation of Reaper, a prefix notation if and a postfix notation if have different nodes, although the semantics of those nodes are more or less exactly the same. And I was filing some tickets for Reaper improvements on the Ruby bug tracker when somebody mentioned that one guy is working on this new parser, which was really cool. And I checked it out. I got excited. The parser wasn't completely finished, and because nobody had used it on a large scale, there were many bugs that me and the Rubocop users unwillingly found and helped to fix in the parser gem. But the library is amazing. It had the best and most responsive maintainer ever, Piotr Zotov. He felt like a robot. I would report a bug and he would issue a bug fix release in like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Really amazing maintainer. So this was the first win of the growing adoption of Rubocop, that the Ruby community ended up with a really great alternative of Reaper. And afterwards, within Rubocop, we created a layer on top of parser and its AST library, which allows you to manipulate abstract syntax trees like regular expressions. We call it AST patterns, somewhat uninspiringly, but you can describe the shape of some code, and this is automatically going to generate the necessary matchers. Matchers are some Ruby methods, and this allowed us to compress code that was hundreds of lines to code that was dozens of lines. Really powerful stuff. And when you need something to inspect your custom code or to rewrite your custom code, you probably want to be using something like Rubocop's AST patterns instead of a raw AST. And probably we should extract this from Rubocop at some point, but that's a different topic. Also, Rubocop provides a lot of infrastructure about gradual cleanup of your code. You can auto-detect the code style of your project. You can start immediately enforcing what is consistent in your code base, and then you can gradually start applying COPs one by one from this starting point, so you wouldn't have any shocking changes. So that's pretty cool. And because there are now many libraries that provide Rubocop extensions, that's another thing going for us. If you're using RSpec and you want to be using the best RSpec practices, you just install Rubocop RSpec, and so some magic happens. So that's pretty great. The performance related functionality was kind of problematic, actually, because it's so dependent on the versions of MRI. we would benchmark on certain versions that, what we suggest is a really great idea. Then the core team would fix this. And on the next version, people start complaining, okay, that's not really faster. Why is Robocop suggesting to me to rewrite the code if it's not more efficient? And keeping track of this is extremely painful, especially if somebody is targeting multiple Ruby releases like most libraries are doing. So we are really wondering how exactly to approach the issue of performance. Probably we are going to attach some extra metadata to all of the performance scopes where we explicitly list the Ruby versions for which we know that something is really going to yield performance benefits versus something that is questionable, unproven, or something along those lines. So the performance aspect turned out to be trickier than we expected. And on the security front, there is always opposition from people who prefer convenience over security. You probably won't be surprised to learn that the majority of developers, when given the choice whether to secure something properly or to make something as convenient as possible for them, would take the latter option. And probably that's why we so often read about some epic security breaches. Security is always an afterthought in our industry until the shit hits the fan.
Yeah, and that's why some people get hit with like a $10,000 AWS bill.
Well, I think that's being lucky. I can imagine much more horrible things happening. We were talking today with some colleagues about the former company of one of the colleagues, and he mentioned that the CEO there accidentally published in a gist the AW production credentials of the company. So I can imagine that the bill was their last concern here.
Have you found that Rubocop and the things that you've learned with it and kind of bring back to Ruby, is it influencing the direction of MRI or the design of the language at all?
Well, I can only hope so, but I do not have empirical data to prove this. I know that after I was complaining at several conferences that Ruby should get a filter alias for find all and select, they finally added it in 2.6. So I like to believe that somebody was listening to me. We have been chatting with Mats at a few conferences, and he mentioned that he doesn't view style the same way I do. So obviously he's not super eager to make changes on this front. I have always considered that giving people too many options which are basically the same is mostly a problem, because it's a recipe for bike shedding and waste of time. I know that he believes that the nuances of the context are really important, and in some case race might be a better fit, in some case fail, and stuff like this. I care just about the semantics. I don't care about the nuances. I also am very frustrated that we have so much functionality in the language which basically nobody uses, and many people don't even know it exists. But we are carting it along for some unknown reason. For instance, most people don't even know that Ruby has a second syntax for commands, the block command syntax. but nobody uses it because it's kind of weird. If the block comment doesn't start at the very beginning of the line, it's a syntax error. So you cannot put indented block comments. The core team has been unwilling to fix this and unwilling to drop this. And this begs the question, okay, what are we supposed to do with it? So even though Rubocop hasn't really influenced the language, I think it really influenced the way the language is being used. We keep some track of statistics about changes to the configuration that Rubocop users are making just by working with the GitHub, the data warehouse. And it seems that many of the cops are never disabled and their defaults are never changed. So we are pretty certain that this has become the gold standard for certain idioms and stylistic approaches in Ruby. So I think that we are paving the way in this manner for some things to eventually be deprecated from Ruby. I'm a big believer that changes should be happening only in accretion-wise manner. We shouldn't be dropping stuff. We shouldn't be breaking changes. But at some point, we should start deprecating things that we know didn't work out, and we are probably better off without them.
What would you recommend the Rails style guide if you're building a Rails project? Is that something that we should start as our baseline and then just kind of customize it to our team, or do you think it's good enough for most projects?
I think it is good enough for most projects because a lot of people participate in its creation. At this point, we are reasonably confident that the Ruby style guide and the Rails style guide really reflect the community's opinion. Because for a while I was the only editor, people would say, okay, those are Buck's personal preferences. But trust me, a lot of the items there are not my personal preferences at all. I just agreed that, okay, that's what the community does. That's what we are going to prescribe. We should be unifying. We should be seeking consensus. That being said, if you have very strong preferences and if you can get your team to agree on those, it's completely fine to be modifying the style guide. I think Dave already mentioned something along those lines. That's a good starting point. And if you don't know Rails well, that's an amazing starting point. But if you feel you're yourself an expert, if you think that you know what you're doing is better than the common prescription, you should totally go ahead and do your own thing. In the end of the day, I think that it's much more important to have consistency within a project and within an organization, ideally, than what exactly you are doing. As long as it is consistent, you're doing great. Sure, there are some level of greatness, but let's just get to great, and we are going to take it from there one step at a time. I believe that Charles is trying to say something, but we cannot hear him. Yes, now we can.
Okay, yeah, I had to leave and come back, which meant that I had to make somebody else the host. So I've been using Rubocop, and as I said, I've actually got a plugin that just runs it on my files when I save them in Visual Studio Code. And I don't know if you've covered this because my connection just dropped off a couple of times, but there are a few things in there that I've run into that are somewhat annoying because it gives me an error message. One of them is the line length. The other one is the description at the beginning of a class. And sometimes it picks it up, and sometimes there's like an extra carriage return or something in there, makes it so that it doesn't quite pick it up. And I think I'm using annotate models or something, and so it doesn't do it quite the same way. Have you run into any of these kinds of things?
Is this a question for me? If so, not. Otherwise, I would have fixed it by now.
So if I have an issue with one of the rules, can I modify the rule?
Yeah. So there are varying degrees of modifying the rule. I don't remember what exactly were the configuration options, for instance, for the class documentation, but there are some global things like you can ignore some rule locally within a file with special metadata. If you don't want to put the metadata in your source code, you can exclude certain files in the configuration of the COPs. Every COP understands an exclude and an include directives that basically limit its scope. Also, that there is one really crazy feature about almost nobody knows. The configuration files of Rubocop are searched hierarchically. So you can put one Rubocop YAML in your RSpec folder, and another in your root folder of the project. And when you're working on the specs, Rubocop is going to pick up the file that's closer. So there you can have very relaxed style, but you can have significantly stricter style when it comes to your business logic. And a very common use case for this was that specs usually need to have very long descriptions. So for the descriptions to be meaningful, and in the specs you can go and put line length disabled or 120 or whatever, and that's pretty cool. But we really made it very flexible. I just think that nobody took the time to read the rather lengthy manual that goes with it.
Right.
Some of your conference talks, you touched on the future of Ruby and the future of Rails. I'd love to get kind of a summation of your thoughts of where you think the language is going, what its future is like, and also the future of Rails and other Ruby frameworks.
That's one of my favorite discussion topics. So I'm happy you asked about this. Well, I'm a little bit worried about the future of Ruby today, because I see that Mats is talking a lot about the maturity of the language, the ecosystem, and that's great. But there isn't a clear vision as to where we are going. That there are a couple of cornerstones for Ruby 3 that he's repeating on most of his conference talks in the past 3, 4, 5 years. Like we are going to make Ruby 3 times faster than Ruby 2. We are going to have a better concurrency and parallelism model. We are going to clean up some legacy stuff. But he never. We are going to have duck typing functionality for some definition of the duck typing inference functionality for whatever this might mean to different people. But there is very little concreteness to the plans. For instance, there was never a clear plan about how Ruby 3 was going to become 3 times faster than Ruby 2. I think that at the beginning, when the 3x3 initiative was announced, many people got excited that some big internal changes were going to happen to MRI that were going to give us this speed boost. But this wasn't really followed up by anything specific. That there were several incremental performance changes, 5% here, 10% here. And Matt started joking, or maybe saying it seriously, repeating on many talks that we should start counting the 300% from the release of Ruby 2.0. And it's not like Ruby 3 is going to be 3 times faster than whatever the final release in the Ruby 2 series is. So many people started speculating that if Ruby 3 takes 15 years to be developed, we are organically going to get the 300%, maybe a bit more, and that's worrisome. The same about the duck inference. For a couple of years, Mats was talking at conferences that he was considering adding optional static typing to the language. Then one day he said that he reconsidered and he's now aiming for duck inference, which is cool because it requires less effort from us, from the developers. But then this wasn't followed by any specific details. So go figure how this is going to look, who is going to work on it, when is it happening. The concurrency and parallelism are starting to take some shape in the form of the guilds, but there is still no commitment that that's going to be the promised solution. This is still developed mostly by one person out of the main Ruby source tree. So that's kind of worrisome to me. And when it comes to the cleanup, I don't think that Mats has committed to a single thingy that's going to be deprecated, fixed, or something along those lines. So I have been talking a little bit at conferences about a different roadmap for the future of Ruby, a roadmap which is actually concrete and that I think makes a lot more sense. Implementing persistent data structures alongside the existing data structures in the language. Persistent data structures are going to tremendously help us to have concurrent applications written in Ruby, safe concurrent applications. That is, obviously, we can write whatever we want even now. I think that we really need to commit to the concurrency model, to the concurrency API. And I think that instead of devising something custom for Ruby, what essentially guilds are, we should be trying to fit a tried and true concurrency abstraction, like communicating sequential processes from Go, from Clojure, into Ruby. So this is not going to introduce a lot of cognitive overhead for Ruby developers. Nobody likes custom stuff that are used just in the context of a single language. I also think we should commit to what exactly are we fixing, deprecating. If it were me, for instance, I would fix the block syntax comment. I would either deprecate for real the loop keyword, or I am going to fix the scoping of the variables inside it so it doesn't leak outside for, I mean, not loop, sorry about this. So I would have fixed this. I would have re-examined a lot of inconsistent APIs, like the predicate 0 returns true or false. The predicate non-zero returns either its receiver or nil, which is so confusing to so many people. I really think that there should be some sit down analysis of the usage patterns of the language, and a cleanup and realignment that goes with it. I also really want to restructure significantly the standard library. Some cool things like the set class should be promoted to the core library, should be given literal syntax, because we cannot be encouraging people to forever do set arithmetics using arrays. That's kind of crazy, but pretty much everybody does this in Ruby. We shouldn't be carting a million of legacy libraries that nobody is using with the standard distribution. The standard library should be significantly reduced in size. Everything non-essential should just be extracted as standalone gems. If somebody needs them, they just install it. I don't really consider this breaking compatibility, as everybody is using Bandware anyway. So adding 1-2 more lines to your gem file is not really going to be the end of the world. So I would really like to see some efforts in this direction, and maybe some more exciting changes to happen as well, because all of this is just catching up to the competition. But I remember the days where Ruby was the heart of innovation in the IT community, and I want to see those days again. Mats has been speaking a lot recently about surviving, but I believe that all of us should be speaking just about thriving, about a strong Ruby community, a lot of excitement and passion about the language, and not going to Ruby conferences and have 9 out of 10 talks there be about Rust, Elixir, Go, Crystal, and so on. I think that the fact that on many Ruby events people are barely talking about Ruby is a very bad sign for the health of the community. Yes, Ruby is not going away anytime soon, but this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried. And I haven't forgotten the second part of the question about Rails. I can pause here if somebody wants to follow up on the Ruby stuff, or I can power through with Rails.
I would just love to. I mean, a lot of the things you're talking about really make sense to me. I mean, is there any desire out there for people to fork Ruby and start adding some of this in, or pulling some of this out, depending on what you're talking about?
I think that there is some desire to do it, but I think that this is going to be an epic mistake, because at a time of weakness in the community, the worst thing you can do is be divisive in the community. I think that what we really need is a better stewardship of the language. Some more clarity about the goals that have to be achieved, the problems that have to be solved, because I honestly believe that Ruby's development is happening more or less on autopilot right now. It's governed by some really great individuals, but they're focused on solving their own problems, which are not necessarily the problems of the broader Ruby community. When I was in Japan for Ruby Kaigi, I learned a lot about how Ruby was stewarded, and many of the findings there were really worrisome to me. Like most of the design discussions are happening in person in Tokyo. Almost everybody on the core team is Japanese, and it's very hard for outsiders to be included. I know of a few foreigners who are part of the core team, and I think that all of them are fluent in Japanese. So you can say that the bar for entry is kind of high, and that's a bit worrisome. I also wonder, is somebody on the core team even listening to all of the sign signals that the community might be sending to them? That's something that really bothers me and makes me somewhat skeptical about the future, because I would have expected more efforts towards keeping the momentum, keeping the growth of Ruby at a time where there is better competition than ever and a stronger competition than ever.
Mm-hmm.
So transition that to Rails now in terms of the future of Rails. So in terms of Ruby,
I can complain here. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are some big companies that like GitHub just got on 5.2, right? And Shopify as well, Basecamp. So you've got a lot of companies making significant money that have large user bases that have a vested interest in both the framework and in the language. How do you see that influence the future?
Well, I believe that those companies are the main thing that keeps the Ruby community going right now. Unfortunately, Rails is still the killer use case for Ruby. I was hoping that at some point Ruby's usage was going to divest in more avenues, like becoming a popular language for server-side scripting, system administration, something like Perl, Python. I was hoping that it can go big in the browser with OpenRB, or it can go big on the desktop scene with MacRuby, or with RubyMotion on the mobile scene. But still, almost all of the Ruby developers are Rails developers, and that's the biggest tribute to the might and the prowess of Rails. It's probably the most recognized web framework in the world, the most widely used. I wouldn't say it's the best, but it's really very versatile, and it gets the job done. The company I work for is also a big Rails user. I think we have one of the largest Rails code bases in the world. We are not exactly proud of this because huge monolithic Rails applications are nothing to be proud of these days, but the fact remains the same. I think that Rails is not suffering from the project problems that are plaguing Ruby. The leadership, the vision of Rails is very strong. You always know where the framework is going. DHH he has been doing a great job adding some really important functionality here and there. Maybe the pace at which the adoption of new functionality was happening was slower than some of us wanted it to be, but the fact remains that you can see that the leadership of Rails really cares about the opinion of the community. Things are constantly progressing at a good pace in the right direction. There are some questionable choices here and there, like TurboLinks 1, 2, 3, and still nobody uses those. It was really funny for me to see that one of the key features for Rails 6 was going to be a rich text editor at a time where it seems people stopped using those, but it cannot be all rainbows and unicorns. I think that for what it is, Rails is almost perfect. A full stack web development framework that's pretty configurable, that can target a lot of problems and has infinite use cases. I'm wondering, however, whether the time of the full stack web frameworks has passed, because at least in our company, we are gradually moving away from the traditional usage of Rails, and we just use it as an API to power standalone single page applications or some other data consumers. For us at this point, Rails has become mostly a JSON API provider, a GraphQL provider. We don't really care at all about the view layer. So I think that it would be really nice if future versions of Rails kind of respond to this trend, make it even easier to build decoupled web applications with a completely static front end, and Rails just being the API provider there. I think that's going to be pretty cool, but I don't think it's going to happen in the foreseeable future, looking at the signs and indications that we've been receiving from DHH and the rest of the core team.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common pattern that a lot of companies have moved towards, using Rails as an API layer. Although I still have hopes that that we may see something like LiveView for Phoenix. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's not even released yet, but it's a server rendering solution that kind of stacks up against a single page app strategy, maintaining your server rendered view templates. So I have hopes that we'll see something like that for Rails. I guess the trick there is just making sure it would perform.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool.
If people are looking for more information on that, we did an episode on Elixir Mix with Chris McCord and talked about that. So we'll make sure we get a link to that in the show notes. But yeah, we had a long talk about what it is and how it works. Well, anything else we want to jump on? We're about at the time limit anyway and need to do picks, but I want to make sure we cover everything.
No, nothing from my side.
All right, cool. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Dave, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, sure. So what do I want to pick today? So the other day, my wife's van got a flat tire. It's a brand new tires. It's a new van, so I was kind of bummed out. So I had a air compressor handy, and I was able to reinflate the tire, but you could hear that sound of the air just leaking out. So we got a pretty nasty hole. So I ordered on Amazon some patches, and it's actually tire plugs. So now I'm just going to keep those in the car, so I don't have to get the spare tire out and stuff. I could just patch that tire real quick and get that over to the shop to have them properly fix it. So it's one of those things where it's a 2018 Odyssey van. They put the spare tire like kind of in the front of the car. So it's right behind the cabin seats for the driver and passenger. And you have to navigate around the floorboard, pull up the carpet to actually get the spare tire, but only half of it is visible. So you have to kind of like awkwardly angle it to try to get it out. It was a horrible experience, like horrible Honda engineering there. But other than that, the car is awesome. But I think that's the last time I'm going to use that spare tire. Instead, now we just have a plug kit that's in her car, and we have an inflator. So, we have that option too.
Yeah, having worked on my own cars, I maintain, you just proved the point, the people who design the cars are not the people who use or work on the cars.
Yeah. Definitely agree there. So the other pick that I'll pick is something called, it's an extension within Visual Studio Code, and it's called LiveShare. It's made by Microsoft, and my coworker and I were playing around with it. It's really awesome. There are some other editors have this functionality as well, but now it's in VS Code, and it allows you to create a session. You can also share your server. So if you have a Rails server running, and you can also share your terminal. But what it allows you to do is have multiple people on a audio call as well as a screen, sort of a pseudo screen share, where you are able to both be working on the editor at the same time. And it pulls in your own extensions into this new session. So all your key bindings and everything that you are already familiar with, you can still use in this one shared session. So you can both be chugging away and coding at the same time in different files and, kind of working with it. It's kind of like a on-premise IDE Google Docs screen share kind of deal. It's really neat.
Yeah, the thing that was interesting when they announced it at Microsoft Connect last year, they were showing it off, and it was interesting because you don't even have to have Ruby or anything installed on any of the client machines, just on the machine hosting the Visual Studio LiveShare.
Yep.
And so, yeah, it all runs through your IDE, through your Ruby VM, and does all the work on your machine. And so, yeah, you can share it to anybody who has VS Code or Visual Studio, and it just works.
Yep, pretty cool.
Nate, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, it's kind of on that same topic. One of the challenges that I've got with sharing through Visual Studio Code is previewing, and it may be that I don't know how to do this yet, but it's showing. So if we're doing web development, it's showing the results on screen. So we'll make some changes in the code, then we want to go see what's happening and preview it. And so because that's been a bit of a challenge, I pair with my teammates, and I also pair with some friends over the weekends and evenings. And one of the things that's worked really well for us is the Mac Messages screen sharing, which if both users are on a Mac, you can connect through Messages, and there's a little drop down on the top where their name appears, and you can invite them to share your screen. And you can even grant them access to control your screen as well. And that has worked incredibly well for us. But obviously, it's got the caveat that both users need to be on Mac.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for my picks today.
Awesome.
That is amazing. I did not know that existed. That's really cool.
Yeah, it sounds pretty handy to me. I'm going to jump in with a few picks. So lately, I had been feeling rather burned out. I have complained about being burned out, I swear, like half this year. But anyway, folks kind of know what's going on in my life, or what has gone on in my life over the last 6 months or so. And some of it's just been some rough stuff. But I also got to the point where I realized that the reason that I'm doing a lot of what I'm doing is to make a better life for my family and to be around for my family, and I hadn't been, which led me to make a couple of decisions. One of which was just to hire some people to help me out. The other decision that I made, though, was I looked at my wife and I said, we need to just go do something as on a family trip or something. So we used VRBO, which is a vacation rental website, kind of like Airbnb. And we just took off for basically 5 days and had a terrific time. We didn't go very far. I live in Lehi, Utah, and we went up to Park City, Utah, which is half hour, 45 minutes. But yeah, we just rented a condo up there, spent some time together, had a great time. And so I'm going to just, I guess, encourage people to go find opportunities to do that kind of thing. And you don't have to go very far. we stayed in most of the time and just played games and watched movies and stuff. So so get out and do that. The other thing that I'm going to shout out about is one of the things that I did with my 12-year-old and my brother-in-law. They came out and stayed with us for a day. And a few other of my nephews, was we played Rocket League on the Nintendo Switch, and that was a ton of fun. So I'm going to shout out about that. And having mentioned that, it also occurred to me that that's what we're talking about next week is Ruby on the Nintendo Switch through using Ruby Motion. Amir is coming on to talk about that. So if you're looking for that episode, yeah, it should be cool. I think it's next week. It might be the week after. Yeah, next week we're talking to him. So anyway, great stuff there. Buck, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, sure. So I have been doing a lot of project documentation work recently, because I had this insight that the foundations of a project really matter. And no matter how good code you think you wrote, how useful the functionality is, if people don't understand the project, the functionality, you really failed. So for a while, I was looking for the optimal documentation system. At first, I was trying to write documentation using Markdown, because like everybody, I'm pretty familiar with it. And I was using the Read the Docs service to generate and host this documentation. But I was really frustrated with the Python Markdown parser that it uses and the various limitations that it has. After experimenting with many formats, I found a really sweet spot, at least for me, using AsciiDoc instead of Markdown, and publishing the manuals using Antora, a documentation publishing system from the authors of AsciiDoc itself. The reference AsciiDoc implementation is written in Ruby, by the way, these days. It's the AsciiDoctor gem, and it's so cool. It has a lot of compatibility features for Markdown users. I think that 70% of the Markdown syntax work natively with AsciiDoc as well, but it has so much better support for simple things like admonitions, footnotes, tables, nesting is sane. It's really amazing. It's such a joy and pleasure to be working with AsciiDoc that I have been wondering a lot recently, how did Markdown became so famous if AsciiDoc is more or less the same format, but it has an amazing specification, all the features that you might need, a ton of export options, and so on. So I can heartily recommend this. On the subject of documenting stuff, another small pick from me. It's a classic. It's Jekyll. I used to have a couple of personal blogs that were using Octopress, and for a couple of years I was posting there very rarely because upgrading Octopress was a nightmare. They stopped supporting it, so I had to constantly switch to some old Ruby profiles just to regenerate my site and be able to publish it. So this was a very, very frustrating experience. I played with a couple of modern static site generators like Hugo, whatever. And at the end of the day, I decided to revisit Jekyll. I saw that they made a lot of progress, and using it was so much simpler than using Hugo. Hugo had some really long manual, a million configuration options, and some really weird theme configuration setup. With Jekyll, I managed to do what with Hugo took me one day in 10 minutes. So if somebody is looking to restart their blog, I think that the tried and true tool is is pretty cool. And the final pick from me is for everybody who has a lot of nodes in their life and is looking for a better way to organize them. That's the Bear app. For many years, I was keeping track of nodes, to-dos, etc., using Evernote. And it always bothered me that even though Evernote was pretty cool, I used like 10% of its functionality, and it didn't support Markdown or any reasonable markup for this matter. Some colleague recommended me Bear a few days ago, and I have gradually been moving all of my nodes there. It's so beautiful, simple, and useful. Really great to focused and really empowering you. So if somebody is into note taking, I can heartily recommend this. Or org mode. Bear is not perfect. It has versions just for iOS and Mac OS, but I assume that most Rubyists are using this anyway, so probably for them it is okay. For everybody else, we've got Emacs and org mode, and that's all from me.
Awesome. Well, if people want to find you online, where do they go?
Well, they usually go to Twitter. I'm pretty active there. I'm also pretty active in the Clojurian Slack for Clojure developers, and I guess some Rubies go there. And everybody can find my contacts at metaredux.com. That's the new JQ blog. I promise I'll do my best that this time around there are going to be interesting articles about Ruby, the future, and everything in between.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming. That was a lot of fun.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, guys. Take care.
Yeah. Take care.
All right. We will wrap up and we will catch you all next week.
Bye.
Wow, he jumped right off. All right. Well, about 2 minutes and then it's Elixir Mix.
Live share.
What was that?
Stop the Facebook live share.
I think you have to do it because you're the host.
Oh.